This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is the history of professional wrestling. I have three experts and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is the history of professional wrestling, mostly in the U.S., but we'll also probably tackle a little bit outside the U.S. I have three people who are experts on it, and like I always do, I want to give them each a chance to say who they are and how they got interested in the subject, and then we'll hit the ground running. So in the top left of the screen is Christopher Stacy. Christopher, or Chris, if you prefer, if you could give a little background about yourself and your interest in pro wrestling.
I'm Christopher Stacy, professor of history, LSU Alexandria. My interest in professional wrestling began as a kid. In the history of professional wrestling, briefly, how I got into the studying, I got into an intellectual rut. My area of expertise is slavery and the Civil War, and I was just wanting to do something different, and I already had an intellectual itch to scratch with 20th century American history, and it's really, really weird. I got the flu one time in I guess it was 2014, and I started looking at old YouTube wrestling videos. And I thought to myself, has anybody written any history of professional wrestling? So I did just a brief search and found out not many. Scott, interestingly enough, was the only person who had written, that I know of, recently a monograph. So I started from there, and I'm very, very close, a conclusion away from having a full manuscript after. I like these other fellas, I teach at a teaching-centric college, not Division I research. So our research and scholarly standards are minimal. So it's taken me a lot longer than I anticipated.
So you didn't grow up watching professional wrestling then?
Yes, I did.
Oh, you did?
Okay. Mid-South and WWF. We also caught some other territories like the NWA, WCW. We caught a little World Class. Didn't catch any Memphis. That was sort of a discovery, a happy discovery that I had when I really started this project. I started this project looking almost exclusively at Mid-South, and then realized, well, okay, there's other territory. I didn't even know of the territorial system until I got into the research. Okay. So I expanded to basically cover, my book is going to cover the Deep South, most of the Deep South.
Okay. I see a cat's shadow in the back there of you, Aaron. Aaron, if you give a little background of yourself.
Yeah,
and
lurking around. Yeah, I'm Aaron Horton. I'm a professor of history at Alabama State University, and my academic specialty is actually modern German and modern Japanese history. So with a little bit of modern Korea mixed in as well. So I've been a wrestling fan since I was a kid, just like Chris. And one of my earliest memories of wrestling on TV was the famous Hogan-Andre match in '88 on the main event that 33 million people watched, including me. I remember watching it when it happened with the twin referee. It was ridiculous. I've watched it since then. It was ridiculous, but it just seemed larger than life, and I was really drawn into all of it and became just obsessed with wrestling. I watched as much wrestling as I could find on TV, which by 1990, when I was watching it a lot, was mainly, of course, all the WWF programming, but also a lot of WCW, which I'm from East Tennessee, so it was sort of WCW territory, of course. Yeah. Yay!
Hey.
And I got into writing academically about pro wrestling, kind of like Chris. I felt like I was in a rut, just sort of doing the, legacy of World War II type stuff with German history, for example. And I just wanted to write academically about something different. So, like Chris, I just sort of went down that rabbit hole and decided to apply my training as a historian to something that I've always been a fan of. And I too have expanded my knowledge of wrestling history and the territory system. Scott's book is fantastic. And I was pleased to see that someone had written a scholarly, from a historian's perspective, a scholarly history of American pro wrestling. These days, I would call myself mostly a fan of Japanese pro wrestling, hence I'm wearing my New Japan shirt. And but mainly because I feel like in general they treat it with more respect, treat it more like a sport than you generally find in WWE today, for example, a bit more seriousness, and it is more reminiscent of how I felt watching it when I was younger, even though looking back, a lot of that was pretty ridiculous. So that's I guess that's the that's the short, quick, and dirty introduction to who I am and my interest in wrestling.
And Scott Beekman, finally, he's the first guy that I had contacted that put me in touch with the other two fellows. So Scott, finally, it looks like you have your video and audio working. So welcome, and
apparently
a little background about yourself and your interest in pro wrestling.
Sure. I am a professor of American history at the University of Rio Grande, which is a little tiny school in Southern Ohio. And like these gentlemen, I was a fan as a kid. I'm a bit older than they are, so I was an NWA fan in the 70s, and then a Georgia Championship fan after that. And I began my professional career actually writing about mid 20th century American Nazis, and then realized I probably needed to find something else to do for a couple of reasons. And one night was just watching. I don't even know what federation I was watching, and it registered with me that I don't know that there's a book, just a general history. And so I contacted the press, and they were like, "Yeah, if you want to write it, we'll go with it." And so that became Ringside: History of Professional Wrestling in America. And since then, I've primarily focused on writing about wrestling history. I'm currently have a couple of projects going on. One of them is a full-length biography of a guy named William Muldoon, who had a very lengthy public career that began as a wrestling champion in the 1870s and 80s. And I'm hoping that manuscript will be done by the end of this year. It's been going on way, way, way too long. And then the other project is sort of a more open-ended one in that I'm trying to create a database of every match, result, challenge, arrest, birth, death related to American professional wrestling during the entire 19th century. And so I'm putting that into a piece of timeline software. And I that one may never be completed, but it's sort of a long-term project. I frankly don't even know what I'm going to do with that database when I finally finish it. But that's what those are the two projects I've been working on most recently.
And just a little background about my own interest in pro wrestling. I grew up in New York City, so I grew up with the WWF, basically, and that dominated. I didn't even know there was anything outside of that. I do remember when I was a little boy, my dad hated pro wrestling, and the reason was when he was a boy, my dad was born in 1916, he was a fan of Jim Londos, the Golden Greek. And
Sure.
then when he was about 20, 25, he found out that wrestling was fake, and he hated them. He hated them, that they were ripping people off and stuff.
Yeah.
And the other memory that I have, I went to a school called Franklin K. Lane High School in New York on the Brooklyn-Queens border. And in the late 70s, they would have dark shows from the WWF there. And one of the legendary shows, even though I didn't see it, was Andre the Giant against about 12 or 15 midget wrestlers. And apparently Andre was flinging them off like an elephant would to mice or whatnot. And it was famous. And let me just then, before we even get started into wrestling, just ask a few little questions of you, and then we'll hit the ground running. Whatever happened to midget wrestling?
It's still around.
It is?
Still around, yes.
Because I thought that went out in the 70s. You used to have dwarf bowling and dwarf tossing and midget wrestling, but it's like they seem to have vanished. It's not in any of the big organizations, is it?
No. There's a group called the Micro Wrestling Federation that appears in bars, I think, mostly, and it's all midget wrestling. But yeah, the more respectable organizations, thankfully, abandoned.
So let me then start with just this sort of posit. It seems to me, from what little I know compared to probably what you guys know, that this is sort of, I would call it, an interregnum in the popularity of wrestling. When I look back, at least from the last 70, 80 years, the late 40s to the early 50s, the Gorgeous George era, 60 to 70% of households were watching wrestling. It was on every Friday or Saturday night. Huge boom. Then it fades a little bit for 20, 25 years. We get the WWF started. We got the split into the AWA, the NWA, and the minor federations or whatnot. Then along, finally, they give the belt to Hogan here in the WWF. You get the rock and wrestling stuff, the cartoony stuff of the 80s. It goes into a little bit of a dip then in the early 90s. Then we get Stone Cold, we get Rock, we get the WCW and Goldberg. Then after that Attitude Era, it seems, I mean, someone like a Roman Reigns in the WWF doesn't seem to have the same charisma as The Rock or even Hogan or Gorgeous George. What is the state of pro wrestling in the U.S. today then? Any one of you want to pick it up?
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I think that you raise a good point. There's no wrestler who has this sort of mainstream crossover recognition that a Steve Austin or Rock or Hulk Hogan or Gorgeous George, to go back further, would have had. And I think that is indicative of the fact that wrestling has become much more of a niche thing since the acquisition of WCW by WWE, WWF in 2001. Since then, wrestling has kind of become a niche endeavor, and it does have a very dedicated core group of fans who probably per capita spend more money on merchandise than they ever have before. But in terms of widespread popularity or recognition, including among the stars, it's not nearly at the level that it was in what was called the Attitude Era, right? The heyday of the WCW versus WWF Monday Night Wars with Austin and The Rock and the NWO and Hollywood Hogan and all that. So that's the short version, that it's something that's now more niche.
Scott?
Yeah, it's that's all absolutely correct. The thing about wrestling is that because it's not an actual competitive sport, it relies on the performers to rise and fall in terms of popularity. And so, yes, it's certainly more niche now than it was in the 90s or the 80s or the early 1950s. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to rise again at some point if a really charismatic performer can bubble up and sort of catch that popular attention, public attention, in the way that a Hogan did or Gorgeous George did or a Frank Gotch did. And so it is cyclical in the sense that it's based upon those performers, but at a certain level, it wouldn't have to be cyclical if you could continually find those sorts of figures who could catch the public attention. It's certainly in a trough at this point. There's no way to dispute that, but I'm confident at some point we'll see it rise back up to the levels of the 90s. It's just going to take someone showing up who's able to carry it on his back in the way that Hogan or Austin did in the past.
Chris, what's your take on it?
In the spirit of the T-shirt I'm wearing, modern wrestling's a bunch of crap. Nobody sells any moves anymore. Seriously, I think if you want to really get most of my perspective, I agree a lot with what Jim Cornette has said about the modern product. Not that I agree with him, everything that he says and all his critiques, but I think he is at the forefront of criticizing the modern product. And his argument's very simple. The decline of the believability of the product. Before McMahon took over the wrestling world, people believed that, okay, what they were viewing was somewhat real, Okay, to quote Terry Funk, if I can't get the people people convinced that wrestling is real, they're going to be convinced that I am real. And I really think it's a problem because at least the WWF product, you have these thousands of indie promotions which undoubtedly do things different. I think the WWF or WWF, that's my age and my wish, but they're over scripted. Everything's a high spot. Okay. I think if they go back to, you're over scripting these guys. Okay. It's not bookers anymore. It's writers, and it's made the product boring. And I agree with my colleagues in that, yes, the product that there does seem to be a nadir in wrestling, but shit, it seems like McMahon can print his own money. So, and I'm going to make something very clear before I get the hate tweets or the hate email. I have all the respect in the world for performers who get into the business right now, because it's tough as hell to get over because of the empire that McMahon has created. But and no, you're not going to put the toothpaste back in the tube. But I do think that there's some things in the past that perhaps the WWE can do to bring back the interest within popular culture. I don't know.
I was watching a video a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, of superstar Billy Graham talking about his match where he beat Bruno Sammartino for the title belt in Baltimore, I believe it was. And he was talking about how in those days, it wasn't sports entertainment, it was considered sports, and how he barely got out of there alive. The old women were throwing piece of broken glass. Is that a good thing or a bad thing that they've lost the heat? I mean, we don't see guys with like the Grand Canyon in their foreheads anymore.
I will say to that is that I was actually at an Indy card a couple of weeks ago where there was heat at a level I've not seen in a long time. But the heat was coming from 7 and 8 year olds who were absolutely merciless towards these guys. And so, they're not grandmas anymore, but maybe, maybe if our kindergartners can just get fired up. I guess what I would say is that it does. I think it's partly because of the age of this panel is that I suspect, come across as sort of grumpy old men wrestler fans. But one thing I would say is that even if we were to go back to the heyday of Hogan in the 80s, not like the product that he was putting out there in the ring, at least in the United States. And I understand that what he did in Japan was different, but the WWF was not particularly impressive in the ring. It was gimmick, it was the sizzle, right? Was there. And so I certainly agree with my colleagues that there's the age of kayfabe is long past, and we will all probably lament that again because of our age. But I don't think that necessarily means that it can't come back to a level that it was before. I really do think, and yes, Vince McMahon, who knows with what he's doing, and I don't have any confidence in him at all. And I agree with Chris, it's way too scripted. You should let guys do their own promos, for God's sake. That doesn't seem too much to ask. But I guess maybe I'm a bit more optimistic about the future of it, perhaps, than others. And I think if someone would show up, that could change some things, and we can't really foresee that. I mean, who could have predicted that Hogan, who had not been a particularly significant wrestler earlier on, could catapult himself to the status he had once he went and became a face in the WWF, or Steve Austin, who had terrible gimmicks before that, becoming Stone Cold, And so you just never really know exactly how these things are going to work out. And so I'm hopeful. I agree with.
And just for people who are not wrestling fans who just stumble upon this, kayfabe is pretending that it was real. A heel is a bad guy, and a baby face or a face is a good guy.
It's a good guy. Yes.
Aaron, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree with Scott. And Chris. For WWE anyway, because of Vince McMahon's decision some time ago that people's promos should be scripted, and essentially their characters are mostly shaped by professional writers, whatever that entails, right? But then you think about someone like Stone Cold Steve Austin or Hulk Hogan or Dusty Rhodes or Ric Flair. No one could have written those characters. They came up with those characters, and there was an air. And when I was a kid, I loved Hogan. Watching it back, it just seems so silly. But no one could have come up with that. No one could have invented. A writer couldn't sit down and invent Macho Man Randy Savage, right? Randy Savage, if you've read about his personal life, he was an interesting character, getting into fights at Waffle House, fighting with the cops, just confronting Jerry Lawler in the parking lot of the South Coliseum. Like the guy, but no one could have made that up. No writer could have said, okay, Randy Poffo, here is your character. That's something that came from within him. That's something that he developed. And I think when guys develop their own characters, it lends it an air of credibility that like you believe them in a way that you don't necessarily believe someone reciting memorized lines. And that is a problem. And I think AEW, All Elite Wrestling, does a better job of that because they don't have scripted promos, and guys more or less are free to develop their characters and do their promos, and some of them do better at it than others. But I believe that's the right way that wrestling should be done, because if you don't give the performers the ability to craft their characters and make it feel like it's really something coming from a genuine place in them, it feels phony. And not phony in the sense that, the outcomes are predetermined, but just, I don't believe this person. They're just reciting lines and they don't believe in it, and therefore I don't believe in it. And I think that's a big factor, that genuine believability of characters that can draw people in. Like, Randy Savage, this guy's nuts, right? Like, I don't know if what's going on in the ring is completely legit, but this guy's nuts. Like, I believe that, and he in many ways was in his private life.
And that's why the 2014, what they call a shoot by CM Punk when he left WWE is considered sort of the closest thing to sort of an important event in pro wrestling, and that he seemed to be speaking as himself.
Yeah, I think so. He's an example of someone that people generally view as real. Yeah. I was actually at the show last August in Chicago, where he came back to AEW after being out of wrestling since 2014. And I've been at a lot of wrestling shows, and I've never heard a reaction like that. It was deafening, and the chants went on for like 15, 20 minutes. And I think a big part of that is because people believe that he is who he appears to be. He's not playing a character. He's being genuine. And I think that comes across more strongly than it does for people who are just reciting lines written for them by someone else.
And Aaron, your take?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, Christopher, rather. I'm sorry, Christopher.
No, I agree with my colleagues. I was just sitting here thinking about how many times I've heard someone in the business say, if a wrestler wants to get over, at least I don't know how anybody gets over in the 21st century. Maybe in AEW, this is good advice. You've got to be yourself. You've got to make the fans believe everything what you do in the ring. You're telling a story in the ring. In the promo, like I said, the quote from Terry Funk is what I was specifically thinking of. But yeah, that's part of the decline of the believability in the business. I think it's a big problem. It's a big issue.
So let's talk about the history of pro wrestling, and I want to emphasize a couple of points. I want to also mention not just U.S. wrestling, but as it comes up, talking about other countries like luchadors in Mexico. It was mentioned about Japanese wrestling. I know the UK has some pro wrestling too, and also women and minorities in pro wrestling and how they figure in. So if we go back to the 19th century, When did professional wrestling get started as an entity aside from amateur Greco-Roman wrestling? Are we talking pre-Civil War or what?
Yes. Well, first of all, let's be clear. There is no such thing originally as amateur Greco-Roman wrestling. Greco-Roman was invented as a professional style by French promoters in the 1930s. Or excuse me, 1830s. I'm sorry. In terms of when professional wrestling starts in America, that's a really, really good question. The earliest reference that I have to someone actually putting out a public challenge to anyone who could come up with the money to face them is 1830. And we have a few guys who would appear on stages by the mid 1830s. In terms of who the first true professional wrestler in America was, in the sense of a professional being someone who makes their living as a wrestler, that's one of those questions we'll probably never be able to figure out. There were certainly guys making a living wrestling by the early 1840s, and they would have been mostly collar and elbow or back hold or side hold style. Greco-Roman, which again was a French professional style, the first references that I found to it showing up here was in the mid 1840s. We had a couple of three French wrestlers, Louis Carrier and Alexia Charles, show up and appear on stages here. And so one of the things that always bothers me about how little respect wrestling gets is that if we're talking about American popular culture, this is one of the longest lived components of American popular culture. There's very few elements of our popular culture that date back to the early 19th century that are still significant parts of popular culture. Professional boxing, horse racing, that's about it, and wrestling. And so it has a very, very long history. Yes, it's a pretty checkered history, but it goes way, way back into the DNA of American popular culture.
And was the original pro wrestlers, were they actually in a ring, or was it the modern boxing match, with the ropes?
Mostly they were on stage. They wouldn't have had ropes. They would have had some mats down or some straws through them out and then park over the top of it on the stage. Very few of them occurred outside, simply because it was hard to make money if they're outside because you couldn't charge people to come watch them.
So, Chris, Aaron, any comments on the history here, starting
No,
off?
I was just gonna. This is not my area of expertise. Obviously, Scott's dove into the early history. Most of my stuff is 20th century, but I referenced it. It's an article that I read in graduate school. Elliot Gorn, Bite, Gouge, and Scratch.
Yep.
Which that's okay. Just to make sure Scott knew about it, I referenced it in my introduction, but that's all I had to say. Was just to tell Scott about it.
Yeah, and that's and what Gorn brings up is he talks about gouging a lot, and where does rough and tumble fighting end and professional wrestling begin? I mean, it's a pretty thin line, and it's difficult sometimes to discern. I mean, a lot of the early guys, the early pro wrestlers, were guys who primarily were boxers as well. The earliest reference I found to someone claiming a match for the American Championship was 1842. And it was Yankee Sullivan, who was better known as a boxer, facing a guy named Alonzo Hubble, who was billed for decades as the American Samson because he was a strongman. And he did strongman acts on stage and then with circuses a little bit. And so neither one of them really were straight professional wrestlers because it was all part of a larger sort of combat sports milieu that they were all part of.
So now we look at the history of other sports, like people talk about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. Although in the 1880s there were pro baseball players. Was pro wrestling in the 19th century, was that segregated from the start, or were blacks allowed to wrestle?
Yes, there were a few. Perhaps the earliest African American pro was a guy named Caesar Colt, who was active in New York in the late 1850s, early 1860s. Although there's some dispute about whether or not he was Native American or African American. He certainly faced some wrestlers were indisputably African American wrestlers. There was a guy named Vero Small who wrestled as Black Sam, who was a collar and elbow stylist who was pretty popular in the 1870s. So it wasn't segregated necessarily, although there were some individuals who drew the color line in the same way that John L. Fullman drew the color line in boxing. So William Muldoon, the guy I've been writing about, had no problem facing Japanese wrestlers who would come over, but he absolutely refused to face African American wrestlers.
Aaron, do you have any comments about the history so far?
I've in the 19th century, I've always found it fascinating that what we later recognize as American professional wrestling or just professional wrestling, it evolved very haphazardly and organically out of so many different styles with so many different elements. Catch wrestling is probably the most important, but when I've read about 19th century wrestling, you have all these different styles, and a lot of the matches were contested under mixed rules, like different falls under different rules. And so it isn't something that someone sat down and invented one day, like, here are the rules of professional wrestling. It's something that was very organic and haphazard. And something similar happened in the early days of football, for example, right? Like, different football games had different rules. And so there's a long process of it evolving into what we think of as professional wrestling, with 3 count constituting a fall, right? And the modern ring with the ropes. Like, there's, in its early form, there's a lot of different variations. And I find that fascinating. It's something that I think when we talk about pro wrestling, not many people are aware of the fact that it began as this milieu of different styles that kind of develop and congeal over time into something resembling what we think of as professional wrestling.
So would it be fair to say that MMA and that kind of stuff is actually more old school 19th century pro wrestling?
Well, you have to be careful here because almost from the beginning, professional wrestling has been worked, and
worked meaning
fake. It was prearranged, and so even it would certainly look more like MMA if we're talking about catch as catch can in the 1880s than modern professional wrestling would. But even then, there's not a direct linkage, I don't think, you can make from 19th century wrestling to 21st century MMA. One of the things that I always find interesting is that there, as Aaron has alluded to, there are all these different strands and types of wrestling that come together to form modern American wrestling. And while we think of catch as catch can or Lancashire styles, whatever you want to call it, as sort of the foundation of modern professional wrestling, there are these aspects of Greco-Roman. The part that I love is that collar and elbow, which was the most popular folk style in America in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, until it's supplanted by Greco-Roman in the 1870s. It's collar and elbow style because it had an opening hold. It was, you put one hand on the opponent's collar, one on his elbow. That is still, to this day, the traditional way of opening a modern professional wrestling match, is with a bastardized version of the collar and elbow lockup. And I suspect most wrestlers don't even realize that what they're doing, is an echo of something that was occurring in the 1840s.
So as we move on towards the 20th century, the big name that looms over everyone else, at least in the U.S., is Frank Gotch. Is he sort of the John L. Sullivan of pro wrestling, or is he more like a Jack Dempsey?
Well, Gotch is, this sort of gets back to something we were talking about before, about sort of the secular nature of professional wrestling. And that in the 1870s and 1880s, William Muldoon was second probably only to John L. Sullivan in terms of popularity of American athletes. And once Muldoon retires, there's no one really to pick up that mantle until Gotch shows up and revives the sport in sort of the same way that that Austin revives it after Hogan's heyday is over. And so I think we have to think of the early part of the 20th century as one of those peaks, in the same way that we think about the early 1950s and the mid-1980s. So I don't know that he's Sullivan. I'm probably more Dempsey than Sullivan, yes.
How about you, Aaron or Christopher? Do you have any comments as we get into the 20th century?
Yeah, look, 19th century is my area of expertise, but certainly not 19th century cultural history. But again, we historians are very much shaped by our graduate experience and what we consume as graduate students and as professionals. But there's a book that I kept going back to and wanting to incorporate in some way to kind of set up my introduction to kind of frame professional wrestling in the 19th century, is Highbrow Lowbrow by Lawrence Levine. Levine's argument is really, it's a little too clean, as my mentor said. Levine basically argues that popular culture in the United States was divided into highbrow and lowbrow. Low forms of culture, high forms of culture, and professional wrestling and a lot of what would evolve into professional sports certainly fell under that purview of lowbrow culture, which goes back to the comments by my colleagues about pro wrestling as a niche culture in the United States. That's the only thing I had. Because I was just wondering if anybody thought of that connection with Levine's book, and certainly Levine's book glosses over the nuances, but I think he's on to something. If we're looking at the mid 19th century, and of course everybody looks at the Civil War as a quote turning point, but that's all I had.
When I think of guys like Frank Gotch, I think about how even though most matches were predetermined, these guys were legitimate grapplers and could very much take care of themselves in a legitimate contest. And that belief that pro wrestling champions in particular should be legitimate shooters, shooter being someone who is a legitimate grappler, and then the variation term hooker, which means basically the best of the best shooters, right, who can lock someone in a submission hold legitimately. I think of Gotch, part of turn of the century wrestling really required those skills because he did these barnstorming tours, like where you would basically, in Alaska, Scott knows more about this than I do, I'm sure, but the barnstorming tours where you would go to a mining town in Alaska, which is something Gotch did under a fake name, and you would kind of go around and clean people out by sort of challenging them to wrestling matches and trying to come across like you're not any good at it, right? You're trying to lure them into betting money, and then you hook them with a submission, and you collect everyone's money who's willing to take these challenge matches. Then you move on to the next town and clean them out. And so there's that, people always kind of joke and laugh about, non-fans anyway, they joke and laugh about wrestling being fake, but for most of its history, having legitimate skills, even if most matches are predetermined, having a legitimate ability was considered important. And not just for those scams, but in case someone tries to shoot on you in a predetermined match and go against the outcome and take the title from you. And so I think one thing that gets overlooked in the history of wrestling, and Gotch is a fantastic example of that, because he probably could have legitimately beaten most people in a real contest, is that it was expected that even though you are performing, in a sense, you are expected to have legitimate skills. And so there's this underlying level of actual grappling ability. And some of those catch wrestling methods, by way of several evolutions, are still present in modern mixed martial arts. So mixed martial arts, you mentioned it earlier, you can tangentially trace a lineage of mixed martial arts back to 19th century professional wrestling. There's also Mitsuyo Maeda, who was a judo player from Japan, who also did pro wrestling and learned some catch wrestling holds and methods, and then sort of taught a hybrid version of judo and catch wrestling that came to be known as jiu-jitsu to the Gracie family in Brazil, whose Brazilian jiu-jitsu then became the dominant style of submission wrestling in modern MMA. So you can see these areas where legitimate fighting all the way up through the present has overlap with professional wrestling, so that I think it's oversimplifying it. There's another cat. It's oversimplifying it to say that it's fake and just leave it at that, because there is this long history of legitimacy that is woven through pro wrestling, even if many, if not, well, certainly now, right? But even in the past, if most of the outcomes are predetermined, there was an underlying legitimate skill set that was required, particularly.
Also, because I know I've read the bios of both George Wagner, Gorgeous George, and Wayne Coleman, otherwise known as Superstar Billy Graham, and both of them in those books talk about how wrestlers in the day would oftentimes, you'd get someone like a manager, classy Freddie Blassie, would say, some kid would be heckling from the crowd and say, "You want to come in and wrestle the superstar, or you want to come in?" And they would, snap their ankle or something, so that the kid would go back and tell everyone, "Well, it's real. I went up there, and I played college football or something, and they beat the crap out of me." So there was also that reason to it. It lended able to do that, lended a legitimacy to it.
Yeah, I mean, what Aaron is alluding to is something that it has a very long history in wrestling, all the way up through the 1960s. The NWA stressed that its champion needed to be able to take care of himself, legitimately take care of himself in the ring beyond anything else he could do. He needed to be able to actually grapple to make sure that he wasn't double crossed. Now, obviously, that didn't always end up in the case, but he was supposed to, at least. And that is one of the things that has certainly changed. Which sort of gets back to Chris's point before about what the product in the ring is different, because now it is lots of high spots, because a lot of these guys don't have a real background in wrestling in the way that a lot of the old timers would have.
So let's get to the Depression, because I know in reading the George Wagner bio, he started out in the early mid 30s. He was a basic nobody for 10, 15 years until he became Gorgeous George. But by that time, it seems that what we could call the modern rules of pro wrestling had sort of legitimized. I mentioned Jim Londos. He bridged the era from Gotch to Gorgeous George. The Strangler Lewis was, I guess, one of the biggest heels. So where was pro wrestling in the 1930s, and were there any black wrestlers there? And had women's wrestling seems to have started around that time?
Yeah, the 1930s. In a certain sense, you could perhaps claim that's the beginning of modern professional wrestling. One of the things that happens is that at the dawn of the 1930s, the New York State Athletic Commission mandates that all professional wrestling matches in New York have to be billed as exhibitions. And once you get into the Depression and you have limited dollars for people to spend on popular entertainment, that's when you start to see a lot of gimmick matches. And so women will show up in far greater numbers in the 1930s to wrestle. The midget wrestling you alluded to earlier starts in the 1930s. Mud wrestling matches, wrestling in oil, all sorts of things. Tag team wrestling, all of that starts in the 1930s as a way to
lumberjack matches,
yes. Any gimmick you can think of probably dates back to the 1930s, because they were scrambling to find ways to get people to show up and see the matches.
How about you guys, Aaron or Christopher? Any comments about the formation in the 30s of the modern template, if we call it that?
No, my stuff is really, for all intents and purposes, most of my book is going to focus almost exclusively post 1948.
Okay. Well, we're getting there. We'll be there in a few minutes.
Oh yeah. No, I'm learning a lot here.
I will raise the point, talking about the 30s, and I keep coming back to this idea of fake versus real and everything. But another thing that I think people don't realize is that from the very early days of wrestling, there were people who were trying to expose it and who were saying, this stuff is fake. And Scott mentioned New York State requiring matches be labeled exhibitions, but you also had, I've looked at a lot of newspaper articles from the 1930s, for example, by New York columnist Dan Parker, who is really entertaining. It's hilarious. Like, I was at the Notre Dame archive looking at some of his stuff in the Jack Pfeffer archive. There were clippings, and it's even in the 30s, he's predicting the outcome of matches ahead of them and saying this stuff is nonsense. Many suspect he was being fed information from Jack Pfeffer, who had a bone to pick with the New York promotional cartel,
Yeah.
and is feeding insider information probably to Dan Parker. But there was also an expose in the 30s, Marcus Scriven's Fall Guys, that book length, and it's full of quite a few inaccuracies, but a book length expose explaining how pro wrestling works. And in essence, the dynamics of how pro wrestling works, it's accurate, right?
Okay.
So I think for a long time, the fans who have been fans of wrestling, they're willing to suspend disbelief because there's always been a discourse around wrestling of questioning its legitimacy and saying, this stuff is fake. And so,
Yes.
because some more recent narratives that I've read, just random articles about wrestling or something, they talk as if Vince McMahon to the New Jersey State Athletic Commission saying pro wrestling is predetermined back in 1988, I think it was.
89, I just don't know.
To get deregulated. They act like until 1989, all wrestling fans thought wrestling was completely real, right? And like Chris said earlier, a lot of them, I think, and Jim Cornette has said this, to refer back to him, a lot of people thought, I'm not sure, I'm not sure that this is on the up and up, but this guy over here is crazy, and I believe in him. And I think, even in the 30s, you find evidence that that's the case, that there's a lot of people saying, a lot of this stuff seems far-fetched. This doesn't seem legit. So it's not a new phenomenon, questioning legitimacy and fans being fans of it anyway.
Yeah, no, Scott.
Yes. Yeah,
Scott,
what Aaron's talking about is a fantastic point, and one of the the long-lived arguments among those who study the history of wrestling is how much did people actually believe what they were watching. There are exposés of professional wrestling going back to the early 1860s. I have a newspaper article where the reporter is complaining because he's in the front row and he can hear the guys whispering instructions to each other. They're walking and talking, right? And every single pro in the 19th century was exposed as a hippodrome. Would have been the terminology they would have used then. It would have called it work. Actually, every once in a while pops up, but a hippodrome is the common term for it. Every single one of them was accused of hippodroming. Every single one of them at some point admitted to hippodroming, but I'm not going to do it again. I'm really mad at him. I mean, working a program dates back to the 1860s, and so it's always been exposed to a certain degree. How much people choose to suspend reality is the question. How much people actually believe is the question. But it's always been certainly out there that it wasn't really a legitimate sporting encounter.
An interesting character that was just mentioned briefly before was Jack Pfeffen. He figures quite well into the Gorgeous George biography that I read. He was sort of a rebel who was sort of an outsider who wanted to be a promoter. I think he was a promoter for a while, and then he got screwed over by the wrestling mafia of New York, if you will. And he decided to go on a vengeance tour around the country with a few wrestlers, showing how I even showed how the holds were done and how it was faked and stuff. Was the 1930s also the beginning of what became the territory, Scott?
The territories, to a degree. I mean, you always had, one of the shifts, one of the real shifts in the history of wrestling was where you go from basically independent operator wrestlers to promoters really controlling things, and that's in a development of the late teens into the 1920s. And once you have promoters really running things, you have ostensibly territories. And so to a degree, yes, certainly not worked out in the way that the NWA is going to map out the entire country and chop it up into individual territories. But there are certainly territories in the 1930s. I guess that's maybe the short answer, yes.
And wasn't there the equivalent of the National Boxing Association for wrestling? Was it because it was accepted as not a legitimate sport?
To a degree, there are attempts to create bodies to govern it that are in the same way that the National Boxing Association was an amalgamation of state athletic commissions. There were discussions and attempts to do that for wrestling as well, by having state athletic commissions get together and do it, and they really couldn't really resolve some of the differences between themselves. And there was also an understanding, I think, by most people involved with state athletic commissions that it wasn't actually a legitimate sporting endeavor. And so the question of whether or not they should even be involved in tightly regulating it beyond just requiring licenses to make sure guys, aren't going to have a heart attack out there. I think that there's not really the will to do it in the same way there was for boxing.
So let's
It
talk.
also,
Oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. No, I was to keep in mind that we're talking about the 1920s. Boxing is clearly a more popular sport than professional wrestling. That wasn't the case in the 19th century, even early 19 teens, you could argue. But by the time you get to the Jack Dempsey era of the 1920s, boxing is clearly supplanted wrestling as the more popular.
So if we go to right after World War II, we get the introduction of television, and I've read, independent of the Gorgeous George bio, that 60 to 70% of the American public was watching pro wrestling for the first 5 or 6 years, up until maybe I Love Lucy came along and became the biggest thing on television. And Gorgeous George apparently had deals with television companies where he would be a spokesman for TVs, and apparently sold millions of television just so they could watch Gorgeous George. He's an interesting character, also in the fact that even though he was a typical wrestler of the 30s or 40s with an athletic build, he took this effeminate, flowery gimmick, and it gets to the idea of homosexuality and pro wrestling, and the neither here nor there. It's there, the subtext is there, but it's never really overtly addressed. And then you have people like Gorgeous George and later some other wrestlers, Adrian Adonis, doing that kind of shtick. So talk to me. Let me start with you, Scott, and then we'll get the other two fellas in. The early TV era, Gorgeous George, and if you look at clips of old, let's say, television shows like What's My Line, Gorgeous George appears on all of these. I mean, he's the first wrestling megastar, isn't he?
Of the television era, yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, the thing about when television comes in and you get someone like Gorgeous George showing up, you have suddenly, it's not just what you're doing in the ring, but it also now it does become that you have to be able to do promos. You have to have microphone skills and a whole different skill set.
Pomp and circumstance
comes into play.
The first guy with
Right.
like the entrance music.
Yes, and so you have to be able to talk in ways that you didn't necessarily have to be able to talk before that. And so, one of the things that sort of starts to push us away from having wrestlers who have legitimate grappling skills is that those guys also need to be not just have a gimmick or a character of some sort, but they have to be competent on the microphone. And Gorgeous George was fantastic on the mic. He had a great gimmick, and he has a gimmick that has a very long life. I mean, if you think about Gorgeous George as the first peroxide blonde heel, and for 50 years afterwards, then the shorthand for the guy who's a heel is that he's got the dyed blonde hair. That goes back to Gorgeous George, and so I truly believe one of the most important professional wrestlers of all time because of the things that he brings into it and the legacy he has. He wasn't a great wrestler. He wasn't particularly good in the ring. He was a mid-carder for a decade when he was just George Wagner before he adopted the gimmick. But he can talk and he has a gimmick, and that becomes very, very important in the era of television in ways that it wasn't in the era of radio or newspapers.
Chris, we're in the 40s. You're on.
Okay. All right. I agree with Scott. There's a little blur. I think it's in my book. If not, it should be. But yes, it is. Come to think of it, it is in one of my chapters. A young boxer by the name of Muhammad Ali ran into Gorgeous George at a radio interview. By circumstance, they were at the same place at the same time, and a lot of Muhammad Ali's gimmick he learned from Gorgeous George. Yeah. So, but the post-war period is, I think, sets the stage for not just the heyday of the territorial period, but also its ultimate demise. What I found, although Tim Hornbaker's book, Decline of Death of the Territories, is great, I think, and he doesn't say it, he doesn't really conclude it, but Tim's got a very narrative, here are the facts, and there's not, I think, enough analysis, which is fine. We can, the professional historians can do the analysis. But if you read Tim's book about the death of the territories, he points out the importance of not only the NWA, which was the National Wrestling Alliance, which was this cartel, this semi-formal agreement among bookers and promoters to divide up the markets. And Tim points out there was a civil antitrust lawsuit in 1956, which really weakened the system, although the nuts and bolts were there. This idea that the NWA created overall peace among the promoters and bookers is just not true. And I point that out in my book, in that, okay, you have these territories, but there's a lot of instability there that McMahon is going to basically, that allows McMahon, along with the other stuff, to come in like a buzzard and just pick off the pieces of the carcass.
Well, we're talking Vince McMahon Sr. now.
No, Junior.
No, he wasn't around. Senior was the guy
Correct.
who broke away. WWF broke away from the NWA, didn't it?
And that's my point. Yeah, that's my point, is that not all of the owners and bookers who had a stake in the territories were members of the NWA, and all the NWA really did was establish a mutually recognized, somewhat, a national champion. And to book this champion, you had to go through the office of the NWA. But there's this misperception and myth that just because of the existence of the NWA, one promoter or booker could not and did not invade another territory or poach their talent. That 1956 consent decree, which I was just looking it up here, I've got it in my book, it took a lot of the teeth out of the authority of the NWA, that civil lawsuit that resulted in a consent decree. So it did, though, stabilize the business after the chaos of the 1930s. But that's what one of the striking things about my research in that part of in the 40s and 50s is the NWA was a hell of a lot less powerful than a lot of people assume and even talk about on podcasts and all the other blogs and all the other stuff online. Anyway, that's what I have to say about the creation of the NWA. It was created in 48, and the lawsuit, the consent decree, came down in 56, which basically required the NWA to change a lot of its bylaws that restricted promoters from staying within their predetermined territorial boundaries.
Aaron, what talking about the 50s, because the first half of the 50s wrestling is still popular, and then it seems towards the latter half of the 50s it seems to wane a bit. What was the reason behind that, Aaron?
Well, for one thing, by the end of the 50s, most networks had stopped the weekly pro wrestling telecasts. In the early 50s, with the advent of television, at one point, all 4 broadcast networks showed pro wrestling weekly. And by the end of the 50s, pro wrestling television, and that was national, but by the end of the 50s, pro wrestling television had become more local for the most part, so that you're not seeing, you might be seeing your local promotion, which most promoters use as a tool to promote their local events, but you didn't really see, usually didn't see, it depended on where you were, but you didn't see a lot beyond your local area on local TV. I was actually thinking before we get out of the 50s, I was just going to bring in Japan, where pro wrestling boomed in the 50s, also with the aid of television. Thanks, of course, to a former sumo of Korean origin, which he hid for his whole life, Ricky Dozen, who was a mid-level sumo who, because of his of these suspicions about his origins in Korea. He immigrated from Korea in the 20s while Korea was a Japanese colony, but he was exposed to American pro wrestling when like American pro wrestling, pro wrestlers would do tours in Japan, mainly for American soldiers stationed in Japan. And he got to know some of the wrestlers and decided he wanted to do that instead of sumo because he hit the glass ceiling in sumo because of essentially racism, right? Like the idea that someone who's Korean can't be a top level sumo, which is ironic because now in sumo, most of the top level sumo are not Japanese now. But Rikidozan as the top star, there's this parallel boom of Japanese pro wrestling in the 50s with the aid of television because he utilized this open wound of the recent defeat in war in 1945 to pit himself mainly against foreigners, mainly against Americans as the top matches. And he wasn't a very tall guy either, right? So there's a size difference where he can play the underdog against an American like Freddie Blassie or Lou Thesz. And some of these matches did insanely unbelievable television numbers, even though there weren't as many TVs in Japan in the 50s. But I think it was 57. One of his matches against Lou Thesz drew something like 87% of the Japanese TV audience. So almost everyone with a TV was watching his match against Lou Thesz. Yeah. And there's a great book on this, actually. There's a chapter in this book, actually, on it. It's called Bodies of Memory by Yoshikuni Igarashi, Igarashi. He has a chapter about Godzilla, but he also has a chapter about Rikidozan and kind of how Rikidozan sort of managed to harness those Japanese feelings of insecurity in the 50s, like this feeling of being emasculated through the experience of defeat in World War II. And here's this Asian guy who is presumably Japanese, it's actually Korean, but presumably this Japanese guy who is valiantly battling against Americans and some Canadians and winning most of the time. And so he tapped into that to become a massive star and really sort of get the ball rolling on Japanese professional wrestling, which would take it shares much in common, but there was always a need in Japan for wrestling to appear more legitimate. You look at Antonio Inoki, one of his disciples who found New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1972, and then pit himself against legitimate martial artists and worked matches to win them, to show everyone that he's legit. And Japanese wrestling typically emphasizes, even now, like harder strikes to make it look more believable. Bloodying each other with slaps and strikes. Their chests are red, they're bruised. And so anyway, back to the 50s, Rikidozan wasn't going anywhere in sumo, and then he's able to essentially create puroresu or Japanese pro wrestling and be his top star really until he dies in 1963. And television went hand in hand with that as well, where he's able to use that to catapult himself into superstardom.
Well, let's talk about, since you mentioned Japan, I want to talk about three other areas, Canada, Mexico, and the UK. And Canada, you had, from what I've read, Quebec was always a hotbed of pro wrestling. And then also, so famously, Stu Hart out in the western provinces. You have the luchador type wrestling in Mexico. And from what I've read, pro wrestling, I don't know when it got started in the UK, but that was almost more like a bare knuckles kind of thing. They seem to like the blood more there. So if you want to take up on any of those, Scott, why don't you take one up?
Sure. Well, so in England, it was called all-in style, which was a pretty wide open style that gains a lot of popularity in the 1930s. But the thing I would point out here is that if we're talking about modern Western modern sporting culture. England is where that starts in the early part of the 18th century, and boxing and wrestling are significant parts of that, beginning in the early 18th century. And so, and even before that to a degree, but certainly with professionals, it's early 18th century. And so there's a very long history of professional wrestling in England that is far longer than anything we have here, much like Japan sumo is far older than anything we have here. And the catch as catch can style that is introduced in the U.S. in the early 1880s to become sort of the foundation of modern American professional wrestling was a folk style, an English folk style. It was often referred to as Lancashire style. And so much of what we think of as American professional wrestling in the modern sense is a melding of English folk styles that had become professional styles there with the French Greco-Roman style that was a professional style from the very beginning. And so England has a wonderfully rich history when it comes to professional wrestling, far longer than we have, certainly far longer than Mexico or Canada for that matter. And it's obviously not as old as sumo, which is, Aaron, I have a better number for that, but 1,000 years old at this point. I mean, it's incredible how long it's lasted. And so the English style of the 1930s becomes popular. Looks a lot like American style from that point on. It's fairly similar. Now they have knockouts and they have rounds to their matches in ways that we didn't really have here, but it's pretty American looking from that point on.
How about anyone want to tackle Canada?
Yeah, no, I'm not going to tackle Canada. I don't want to invade Canada. Referencing the Canadian Bacon movie. I'm going to promote one of our colleagues. Look, there's one of the great things about scholars who are now doing professional wrestling. There's now a small community of us. I don't want to say worldwide, but there's someone who has really done a great job. His name is Nathan Hatton, and he's looked exclusively, almost exclusively at the Alberta, BC territories, or whatever the hell they call them, the provinces. But he's done some fantastic scholarship. So if you want a whole other episode, and like I said, I think, Dan, I'm not telling you what to do here, not giving any recommendations, but if you're going to get into a deep dive of the history of professional wrestling, Nathan has done some fan-damn-tastic work on Canada, and I'm pretty sure he would be more than happy to come on another show. And I know Aaron's working on a much larger global project, but I know Nathan has really looked at Canada in a deep dive sort of way.
Well, Aaron, how about Mexico? Do you have any comments on the lucha style, the masked wrestlers and all that?
Yeah, again, not my direct area of expertise, but it is interesting because Mexico's home to one of the oldest continually operating wrestling promotion, now known as CMLL, but founded in 1933 as EMLL. And they still run shows. Well, the pandemic has affected it, but essentially they have run Friday night shows in Mexico City since 1933 with few interruptions. And the style, of course, that develops in Mexico is significantly different. It's going to evolve with an emphasis on high flying and with masks, a lot of masked wrestlers. That's the norm, in fact, although there are people that don't have masks. But and again, I'm not the grand expert on this, but many of the gimmicks, many of the masks and imagery are inspired by Aztec imagery and Aztec culture, so that they are often understood to represent elements of Mexico's history and culture. The Spanish side of things, the Aztec side of things, the Mayan side of things. The interesting thing about talking about different regions is that you you can see the overlapping influences of them. Like lucha style is going to have a huge influence on modern American wrestling. The high flying, the out of the ring dives, right? These are elements that really were first featured heavily in lucha libre style, and then you see them incorporated in Japan and the U.S. and elsewhere because maybe sometimes too much, right? But if you watch a lucha match, if you watch a CMLL show, within the first minute of the match, guys are diving over the top rope onto each other on the outside. Like dives are just expected. And, you know, thinking back to what Chris said earlier, sort of that high speed, don't pause for a second to sell anything style that many critique about modern American wrestling. A lot of those elements come from lucha, but of course, there's also a lot of blood and guts wrestling in lucha, especially in really intense feuds where you have like a mask versus hair, mask versus mask situation. Those matches are often grittier and bloodier than just a typical trios or six-man tag match with the dives and everything. So yeah, it's going to develop its own culture, and both in the case of Canada and Mexico, there's a lot of overlap with American pro wrestling because of our proximity. So you had a lot of lucha wrestlers who wrestled in the U.S., like Mil Mascaras, the Guerreros, who are from Texas, also wrestled extensively in Mexico. There's a lot of same thing with Canada. There's a lot of overlap and overlapping influences, but the lucha style definitely is distinct, and but something that you can now see elements of in pretty much all pro wrestling.
So let us get to the 1960s. This is when I guess most people could say wrestling as we know it now has sort of solidified, and a few interesting events and characters. The first one being Vince McMahon Sr., who was the most famous sort of breakaway from the NWA, setting up the then Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And it was, in many senses, the jewel of the crown because it had New York, Boston, DC, Philadelphia, were all in that territory, the whole East Coast. Bruno Sammartino was the men's champion forever, it seems, in that league. You had, by that time, I guess the most famous woman wrestler I know of was the fabulous Moolah, who's a very interesting and shady character herself. I don't want to get too stuck on her or the things like the Chris Benoit stuff, but we then got managers, what later became the classy Freddie Blassie as the former manager, Ernie Roth as the Grand Wizard of Wrestling. So let me just ask a few things too. Let's start with black wrestlers and female wrestlers. I mentioned the fabulous Moolah. In my WWF, the big name was Ernie the Big Cat Ladd, but I know there were fake guys like Jay Strongbow wasn't an Indian. Let's talk about some of the ethnic and women wrestlers, the gimmicks that started then. Scott, if you want to kick off.
Sure. Well, where to start with that? First of all, ethnic gimmicks weren't necessarily new to the 1960s. I hate to. The Terrible Turks, Matsuda Sorkichi, who was a sumo who came to the U.S. in the 1880s and was billed everywhere simply as the Jap. So you'd also often get matches where you would have an Irish wrestler versus a German, they would promote it as whiskey versus beer matches. And so that angle isn't necessarily new. There's a fake Turk, Ali Baba, ends up through some weird ways the world champion in the 1930s. And so that's not completely new to that point, but it gets back to one of the things that we talked about before, which is that once you get into the television era, you have to have sort of more elaborate gimmicks. And so in the 1950s and the 1960s, we start to see, evil Japanese characters. We start to see fake Nazis show up. We see fake Soviet wrestlers showing up, and so it gets a little more colorful. And obviously you have positive ethnic characters, as you mentioned, Bruno Sammartino or Polish Power Ivan Putski. And so that becomes, sort of part of the standard tool bag for wrestlers to develop some sort of an ethnic gimmick that you can get across better on television and means more on television than it would have if you were, at the local armory circa 1937. And we don't see a great deal of that these days. I think we're probably past the stage where you can really do too much with that. I mean, there's a few guys who still try to work ethnic gimmicks, but not quite as much as we had during that period, which is sort of the golden age of ethnic gimmicks. We want to think about it that way.
Well, some of them did get over the top, like the Junkyard Dog, a black man wearing chains, and then you had like the pimp
Yes.
character. Was it Slick, the pimp character?
Yes, Slick,
Yeah.
right? Yes. Vince K. McMahon is certainly known for some pretty nasty ethnic stereotype characters. I don't think there's any way to get around that. Although I don't think even McMahon would try to pull off some of those gimmicks today in the way that he did in the 80s and 90s. I hope not, but I necessarily had to put anything past Vince K. McMahon. So yeah.
Let me ask both Aaron and Christopher about the WWF. Bruno Sammartino, to me, is one of the most interesting characters because from what I've read of him, not only was he immensely popular with the Italian community and other ethnic groups, but I've read and I've heard other wrestlers speaking about it on assorted YouTube channels. He was one of the first pro wrestlers who stood up for the mid-carders to get them a bigger slice of the pie. And I know that one of the things that was a constant antagonism between him and both Vince Sr. and Vince Jr. McMahon was that Bruno at various times advocated for unions in professional wrestling. So if anyone, let me start with either Chris or Aaron. Unionism, baseball was unionized, football had gotten unionized, a lot of the professional sports were unionized. Why hasn't unionism taken off in professional wrestling? And am I correct in what I'm saying about Bruno Sammartino and his role as a good guy standing up for mid-carders and pro-union?
I don't, and maybe Chris or Scott knows more about this. I don't recall personally reading about Bruno advocating for unions, although it sounds like something he would do based on other interviews I've read with him. But to the larger question of unions in pro wrestling, it's something that certainly the dominant promoter of note since the 80s, Vincent K. McMahon, has attempted to squash anytime talk of it or any hint of it comes up. And Jesse Ventura was trying at one point backstage. Of course, he was a wrestler, but more famously a commentator for the WWF until 1990. Backstage, he was trying to sort of put feelers out and make the beginnings of a union. And Vince got word of it. Rumor is Hulk Hogan is the one who ratted Jesse out. And Vince put a quick stop to it. And so promoters, I think, and not just Vincent K., right? That's the most famous example. But I think because of the fractured nature of wrestling, you don't have a single entity like Major League Baseball or the NFL. It's been harder for people to organize, for wrestlers to organize in any sort of meaningful way. And promoters have been very quick to try to stamp out any mention of unions because, and there's a whole other discussion here that has been brought to the fore by people like Andrew Yang, for example, over the independent contractor status of wrestlers, which kind of ties into that because the WWE, they classify their wrestlers not as employees but independent contractors, and yet they're not independent, right? Because they have strict they have restrictions on what kinds of outside endeavors they can do.
Yeah.
So they can't go work somewhere else on their day off, right? I mean, they're under exclusive contracts. But because they're defined as independent contractors, they don't have to get health benefits. They don't get the sorts of benefits an employee at WWE does. Corporate employees at WWE get 401k, all the benefits packages, but the wrestlers who are independent contractors don't. And so I think there's a whole legal conversation to be had about that, because like if someone's released from WWE, they're under a 90-day non-compete, like at least, so that they can't go somewhere for 90 days and work somewhere else. So calling them independent contractors is questionable for sure. And I think that ties into this opposition to a union, because a union could obviously advocate for much better terms for contracts, and also they can just be released arbitrarily from contracts in WWE, right? Like you might get signed a $750,000 a year contract, as were the Good Brothers tag team a few years ago, and then you get released after 6 months. So what was that contract worth that you signed for 3 to 5 years if the company can just arbitrarily release you? It's something that would be unbelievable in modern professional sports, other sports, like that you sign someone, you draft someone, you give them a big contract, and you say just, nah, never mind. And you have no obligation. It's there's a whole rabbit hole here, or something, right? There's a whole can of worms. That's what I was looking for. There's a whole can of worms connected to that issue for sure. And I think promoters have long attempted to keep the balance of power on their side as it pertains to contracts and paying the wrestlers. In fact, I mean, contracts in wrestling are not that, they're not that old. Like back in the day, it was a handshake deal in most territories. Just, you get a cut of the house, and promoters often tried to, well, some were more honest than others, but promoters would often try to underrepresent how much the live gate was. Like, oh, we didn't make that much money on this show, so your payoff isn't that great. So I think from the promoter side, they're always trying to find ways to nip and tuck the money in a way that, and contracts to benefit themselves.
Chris,
Yeah, I was just going to finish Aaron's comment, and I think Aaron is exactly right. I allude to it in my briefly in my research. I was just going to add that while McMahon is credited and the WWF is credited to raising the payoff, right? There's a myth, there's a narrative that professional wrestlers as workers, and I think people forget that often, well, not often, but they're trying to make a living doing what they're doing, they're workers. So there's this narrative that McMahon improved all aspects about the worker, right? Working conditions, travel, et cetera, got so much better. And that's relative, right? It's relatively speaking, right? The pay is higher, but there's this other darker side to going to work for the WWE that Professor Horton underlined, and that there's this legal. I'm just shocked that none of these guys and gals have brought a class action lawsuit and taken him to court. If they're independent contractors, why are they being treated like full-time employees?
Yeah.
So anyway, I want to go back to the race issue, okay? Because I look at it quite extensively, because my book does focus on the Deep South. I think there's two ways to really look at race in professional wrestling. Number one is the role of wrestlers in the civil rights movement, okay, which is how I've categorized it, and the construction of race, gender, class, anything else about identity that's about the human condition. In that, I found two individuals who were very, very important in the civil rights movement in the South. That was sort of these not untold stories, but very much a part of the story of professional wrestling in the South, and that's Sputnik Monroe
Mhm.
and Ernie Ladd.
Mhm.
Sputnik Monroe helped integrate Memphis, and Ernie Ladd participated in a lesser known professional football strike. It wasn't a strike, it was a walkout in the wake of the 1965 AFL All-Star game, which was held in New Orleans, which I cover. And to make a long story short, in both examples, Sputnik Monroe's main fan base were African Americans.
And he was white, right?
Correct, correct. He's buried not too far from where where I work at LSUA, but he helped integrate the city of Memphis, at least at some of its public facilities, at least the Ellis Arena. But Ernie Ladd is a very fascinating character. He helped, from what I understand from my research, he helped orchestrate a walkout of African American players in the city of New Orleans right after the big civil rights. I don't know if it was before or after the Voting Rights Act of '65. It was certainly after the big '64 federal law that was passed and signed into law by Johnson. But he basically orchestrated a walkout of Black players after hotels and other bars and other public places were not treating the Black players rather kindly. And there's this one hilarious, hilarious in a professional wrestling kind of way, but basically, the doorman in the French Quarter basically said, "Hey, you know what's are not coming into this bar," and Ernie Ladd, in typical Ernie Ladd fashion, "I'm gonna rip the doors off that bar. We're coming in and having a good time because we heard James Brown on a jukebox." And the white door manager basically pulled out a pistol and said, "Well, yeah, no, you're not." And there were other Black players who were experiencing similar disrespect. So their walkout was successful. That's the point I made in the book, in that future book, hopefully, in the manuscript, is that these African American players basically refused to show up for team meetings, and they were going to not play the game. So the league changed the venue from New Orleans to Houston. So there's probably a litany of other stories similar to these that made their way into my manuscript that occurred in the post World War II era.
Yeah, to get back to the McMahon thing, I think he subscribes to that Reaganite belief that a rising tide lifts all boats, although that clearly didn't happen politically nor within the wrestling world. I did want to speak about another issue that has to come up with modern wrestling, and it gets back to this 1992, I believe, Phil Donahue show where both Bruno and superstar Graham appeared on. One was the sex scandal, but the more cogent one till today's is the steroid thing. And superstar Billy Graham was probably the first steroidal super freak big wrestler. When we had the muscle guys, they were guys that were named Moose with big beards, and they were stocky, or they were Ken Patera.
Yeah.
But then superstar Billy Graham comes along, and he's Lou Ferrigno, a friend with Schwarzenegger. Then we get the Hulk Hogan, who takes it to another level. How did steroids change pro wrestling? Because we know about baseball, we know about its effect in football, but clearly someone like superstar Graham set the stage for the 1980s and Vince McMahon Jr.'s obsession with monsters. Which any one of you want to take that? Go ahead.
I think McMahon's been the Teflon owner. Look, if that steroid trial would have gone a little different, I think the history of modern wrestling would look a lot different. There's another overlooked, and I don't know too much about it and didn't get too much into it, but there's also a related, the Ring Boy scandal.
Yeah.
Which anybody, Aaron, have you gotten, or Scott, have you gotten into?
Mm.
Well,
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah.
But it sort of overlapped with the steroid controversies in the late 80s and early 90s. Basically, sexual misconduct by Terry Garvin, most of all, who was a road agent for the WWF. And Pat Patterson was accused of some things. He was Vince's right-hand man, even on to the Attitude Era. But Terry Garvin had behaved inappropriately with teenage ring boys, they called them, basically young men or teenage boys who helped put up and take down the ring at shows. And for them, they basically were doing volunteer work, maybe getting paid like $20 or something, just to kind of hang out and be around wrestling. But Terry Garvin propositioned several of them and, extorted sexual favors and such. So that scandal also drew a lot of criticism. Bruno spoke out on it. In fact, I think it came up on the 92 Donahue show, if I'm not mistaken, among the talk of steroids and such. I speaking more broadly about the impact of steroids in wrestling, a lot of those guys that were big in the 80s and in the early 90s, these guys who had the big steroid bodies, one of the impacts is just a lot of these guys died really young through a combination of steroid abuse, which is certainly not good for your heart, but then the lifestyle of excess, which often included recreational drugs like cocaine and other things, a combination of those. There were so many guys in the early 2000s, late 90s and early 2000s, who were dying in their 40s or even earlier. And so you can see this tangible impact just in the fact that a lot of these guys don't even make it to 45, right? And also it changed the market for wrestlers because the expectation because the standard set by Vince and Kay McMahon was that you had to be, imagine it like a theme park ride, must be this tall, right? To ride, like you had to be 6 feet tall or more, preferably. You had to have a big, ripped, muscular body that guys who had no business, guys with smaller frames who had no business being as big as they got, because they wanted to succeed in the business, felt compelled to abuse steroids just to have a shot. You could be the most talented wrestler in the world, you could be the greatest personality in the world, but if you didn't have the look, that steroid look became the baseline. Like, you don't get in the door if you don't have the right look, unless you're maybe a big girthy heel like King Kong Bundy or somebody. So guys like Dynamite Kid, who's a small frame man, got huge. Davey Boy Smith, his tag team partners, started abusing steroids. And then, of course, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, some of those guys who came up in the 90s, these are small frame guys who are tremendous wrestlers whose bodies were pushed to the limit by steroid abuse. And many of them come to very tragic ends as a result. All four of them, well, Chris Benoit's somewhat different, but Guerrero, Davey Boy Smith, and Dynamite Kid suffered severe effects from that, leading ultimately in all three cases to premature deaths. So Dynamite outlived the other two. He died not too long ago, but he was essentially crippled and in a wheelchair for the latter part of his life. So that widespread expectation with McMahon that you have to have big muscles, you have to be ripped, it put this pressure on anyone wanting to get into the business to take steroids. I mean, even Bret Hart in his book, And Brett was never a big muscle guy, but if you look at him in the 80s versus how he looked in the late 90s, even he's puffed up. And he talks about in his book how backstage, Vince McMahon came up to him one day backstage and said, I like my wrestlers to work out. He didn't say he takes steroids, right? But he strongly implied that Brett, who was a pretty lean guy, but one of the best technical wrestlers ever, he's implying that Brett doesn't have the right look, and needs to bulk up. And of course, everybody knew that the way to do that was steroids. So, I mean, that I think is one of the more positive things about wrestling right now is that attitude is less prevalent, and it's not a mandatory factor to be successful in wrestling. But if you look at the 80s and early 90s, you have a bunch of guys who are carrying way too much muscle for their frame, and it's pretty clear what's going on. And guys started at the steroid trial in '94. You notice that guys started shrinking, like Hulk Hogan's face looked really thin. He shrunk like he was popped like a balloon or something. So, yeah. I mean, you can't talk about wrestling in the '80s without talking about the steroid issue for sure.
Well,
go ahead. I think one of the points that Aaron brings up is a really good one. So we can't just think about the sort of muscle-bound guys as the steroid users. That even the smaller guys are taking steroids. I mean, I would be hard-pressed to think of anyone in the WWF in the late 80s that wasn't. And yes, in part that was to bulk up, but also the steroids were an integral part of staying on the road. It's not just the muscle mass you're building, it's the recovery that you get from the steroids that allows you to be competitive on a nightly basis in what was just an incredible grind of a schedule for those guys. I mean, you had to be almost on something to stay on the road as long as the WWF expected you to stay on the road.
Well, since we're up to sort of the 80s and almost into the 90s, there's so much online that people can read about that. I want to sort of wrap up here as far as where the state of wrestling is now, because the Hogan era, the Rock in wrestling, the Ric Flair, Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, all that, the Monday Night Wars. Again, there's 10,000 hours of it on, and so it would be just recapitulation. But I do want to pick up just a couple of points about where we stand now in the early 21st century. After the quote unquote attitude era, the WWE, after the demise of WCW, became more family friendly. You had, the rise of female wrestling again. First they called them, I think, the Divas, and now it's just plain old women wrestling. You had Ring of Honor came along. The AEW has come along recently and seems to be a legitimate threat. So where, as a wrestling fan, as a young wrestling fan, is this maybe the beginning of a new golden age of pro wrestling, do you think? Let me start. Let's go around the horn. Christopher, your take.
I don't think so.
No.
I hope so. I don't think so. For one reason. The WWE, as long as it's a publicly traded company, is like the McDonald's of professional wrestling. I hate to say,
you should put that in the book, Chris. That's
I want to believe, but I just don't. I don't see it. But what I do see is perhaps a healthy competition emerging, which might offer alternatives to the corporate public. Going back to, and I don't expect professional wrestling, because of the sensitivity we have to historically oppressed others. I don't expect to go back to that era. But pushing the envelope, I think that's what brought the WWE out of its doldrums when it was in a war with the WCW. I think in emerging capitalism, competition is always a good thing. And I don't think we have, in a merchant capitalist sense, a lot of competition here. I hope so. But as long as that behemoth is offers the best alternative to make a really good living or maybe even get rich, I don't see much. If let's see what's going to be most interesting to me is when Vincent K put hands over the reins. What's the direction of the company?
Right.
It'll be very interesting, but I hope so. I hope so.
How about you, Aaron?
I think I think that I really like the mentality, the philosophy of AEW, which is funded by a guy named Tony Khan. He is the son of Shahid Khan, who's the Jacksonville Jaguars owner. But that also shows that to remotely be competitive, you need major resources now. There's no, like, Ring of Honor had its fan base, but it was very niche. Even after being bought by Sinclair Broadcasting, they weren't willing to spend a lot of money on it. So it was a small endeavor with great wrestling, but limited visibility. And Tony Khan is a little younger than I am, but he, like me, grew up a wrestling fan. So I think he has the right attitude toward it, and he has the resources. He has more money than Vince McMahon, right? Like his family wealth. So he's got the resources. The question is, can you keep drawing more people in? Like I mentioned earlier that pro wrestling has become a niche endeavor. So the question is, how do you get more eyeballs on the product? Vince is still the market leader by far, and he's got the big TV deal with Fox and all these lucrative deals. So, I think competition is good because it forces the industry leader to maybe reevaluate some things. We saw that in the 90s when WCW starts beating WWF in ratings. It forced Vince to change a lot of things and to switch from the cartoony, like, wrestling plumber and hockey player gimmicks to something that was more edgy. And I think competition is good. I think the question to me is, and I love the fact that AEW very, very much is about having a booker, Tony Khan. He is the booker. There's one booker. There are no script writers. Essentially guys and women come up with their own characters and their own promos, and some of them succeed and some of them don't quite work out. But I think they're trying to do wrestling the right way, with a lot of modern sensibilities. Sure, modern style is very different than it was in the 80s or 70s. But yeah, I think the big question mark for me is just how many eyeballs can you get? Like, what could catch fire in a way that will draw in more viewers? And certainly AEW got a lot of attention for bringing CM Punk back to wrestling after his long, long absence. And I was in the building that night at the United Center in Chicago, and it was incredible. They didn't even announce he was going to be there for sure. They just strongly implied it, and they sold the building out just on the implication he's going to be there. And when he came out, it was deafening. So there are ways to catch fire, but it's just a question of those intangibles that no one could have predicted Hulkamania except maybe Vincent K. McMahon, right? But like no one could have predicted that Steve Austin, lifetime mid-carder, or Rocky Maivia, who the fans booed when he first was supposed to be a babyface. Nobody could have predicted that they would suddenly catch fire and be packing 20,000 people to arenas all over the country and selling some hundreds of thousands of pay-per-view buys. No one could have predicted that until it started happening. So I as a fan, I'm glad that I have a lot of options. There's streaming services. There's more than just WWE, because if WWE was my only option, I probably wouldn't be watching wrestling anymore, to be honest.
Yes.
Well,
But
final word to you, Scott, about the future of wrestling, where we are.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with my colleagues that the need for competition is really the key part of this, and the AEW is certainly the most legitimate potential threat to WWE we've had since the collapse of WCW and ECW. I like them. I hope that it becomes a viable threat because that would hopefully push WWE to have better product. With regards to getting more eyeballs on it, I would fall back on when you asked about if this is a golden age of wrestling. I would argue that the one place where this truly is a golden age for professional wrestling is with regards to women's wrestling. That women's wrestlers today are so far above anything we've ever seen in the past. And then if we're going to get more eyeballs on it, that perhaps a more female audience attracted by the fact that we have these incredible athletes who are now competing in the women's divisions might be one of the ways that you could do that.
Well, I want to thank all of you. I'll link to your university pages. It was a good discussion, and as I said, you all have books, or most of you have books, and like I said, it was good talking to you about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
thank you. Very entertaining.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.